Revenge doesn't always arrive loudly. It doesn't always come with press conferences, subtweets, or viral clapbacks. Sometimes it's silent, calculated, almost invisible at first. And that's exactly how Caitlin Clark did it. While everyone was focused on highlight reels, logo threes, and sold-out arenas, something much bigger was happening behind the scenes. A power shift. One that didn't involve trash talk or public feuds, but instead exposed just how fragile the old hierarchy of women's basketball really was. For decades, the sport revolved around a few untouchable centers of power. Certain programs decided who mattered. Certain voices decided who was ready. And one name sat at the top of that pyramid longer than almost anyone else. Geno Auriemma. UConn wasn't just a school, it was a gate. And Geno was the gatekeeper. If you were chosen, your path was clear. If you weren't, you were expected to fade quietly. Caitlin Clark didn't fade. She didn't kick down the door either. She walked around it. No public shots. No interviews calling anyone out. No dramatic declarations. Just growth. Numbers. Fans. And eventually, silence that cost other people millions. What makes this story uncomfortable for some isn't Caitlin's success, it's how she succeeded. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't follow the blueprint. And when the people who once ignored her finally came calling, she didn't rush to answer. That single choice flipped the entire power dynamic of women's basketball. And the wild part is this story didn't start with a sold-out WNBA arena. It didn't start with record ratings. It didn't even start at Iowa. It started years earlier, with a phone that never rang. Before the spotlight. Before the hype. Before Caitlin Clark became a name casual fans recognized, she was just another elite high school player with a dream nearly every great women's basketball player shared. UConn. For generations, UConn wasn't just the best program. It was the destination. The place where legacies were built, trophies stacked, and futures secured. If you grew up loving the game, you didn't just admire UConn, you imagined yourself there. Caitlin Clark was no different. She said it herself. Growing up in Iowa, UConn felt like the mountaintop. Geno Auriemma wasn't just a coach, he was the coach. The standard. The voice everyone listened to. If he wanted you, the rest of the sport followed. And Caitlin wanted that call. Not because she needed validation, but because at that point, that's how the system worked. If you were truly elite, Geno found you. He pursued you. He made it clear. Recruiting season arrived, and on paper, it all made sense. A generational shooter. A game-breaking scorer. A player who could stretch defenses in ways women's basketball hadn't fully seen yet. This was supposed to be automatic. But then, nothing happened. No direct phone call. No personal pitch. No urgency. While other recruits heard from UConn early and often, Caitlin waited. And waited. And waited. The silence wasn't accidental. Later, it became clear that Geno had made a decision. UConn already had Paige Buchers. The system didn't need another point guard. And in his mind, that was the end of it. But here's where the story turns. Instead of owning that decision, Geno shifted the responsibility. He suggested that if Caitlin really wanted UConn, she should have called him. Let that sit for a moment. A teenager, expected to chase the most powerful coach in the sport. After being ignored. That wasn't just a recruiting miss. It was a message. You're not a priority. You're optional. You're replaceable. And that kind of message doesn't disappear. Caitlin didn't go on social media. She didn't complain to the press. She didn't leak frustration. She absorbed it. And this is the part most people overlook. At the time, it didn't seem dramatic. There was no public fallout. No viral debate. Just a quiet pivot. She chose Iowa. To outsiders, it looked like settling. No dynasty. No automatic national spotlight. No borrowed prestige. Just a solid program without the brand power of UConn. But beneath the surface, that decision was the first crack in the system. At Iowa, Caitlin wasn't joining an empire. She was the empire. There was no hierarchy to navigate. No legacy players to orbit. No coach holding the keys to relevance. The game was hers. And while Geno moved on, confident he'd made the right call, something else was happening. Caitlyn wasn't shrinking without UConn's approval. She was growing, faster than anyone expected. Every year that phone stayed silent became fuel. Every dismissive explanation hardened into memory. Not anger. Not resentment. Awareness. Because Caitlyn learned something early that would define her entire career. Power only matters if you depend on it. And she was already learning how not to. From the outside, Caitlin Clark choosing Iowa looked like a compromise. No stacked trophy case. No automatic Final Four expectations. No national machine built to carry her name before she ever stepped on the court. To casual fans, it felt like the kind of decision elite players make when the top doors close. A solid program, sure, but not the throne. Not the spotlight. Not where legends were supposed to go. But that assumption missed the entire point. Caitlin Clark wasn't looking for shelter. She was looking for control. At UConn, greatness came with conditions. You fit into the system didn't fit around you. The machine worked because every piece knew its place. Stars shined, but only within a structure that already existed. At Iowa, there was no structure waiting. And that's exactly why it worked. From the moment Caitlyn arrived in Iowa City, the expectations flipped. She wasn't competing for approval. She wasn't proving she belonged. She wasn't adjusting her game to fit a legacy. The program adjusted to her. That freedom mattered more than banners ever could. She wasn't told when to shoot. She wasn't warned about taking risks. She wasn't boxed into what a point guard was supposed to look like. Those deep logo threes that would later go viral weren't accidents. They were the product of trust. The greenest light possible. A coaching staff willing to live with the chaos because they believed in the result. And almost immediately, the results started rewriting expectations. Crowds grew. Energy shifted. People started paying attention. Not because Iowa was winning titles, but because something about this player felt different. This wasn't dominance built on efficiency alone. It was spectacle. It was confidence. It was audacity. Every shot Caitlyn took from absurd range wasn't just a highlight. It was a statement, a quiet challenge to the idea that elite basketball had to look a certain way to be respected. And while the numbers kept piling up, something else followed her everywhere: fans. Not just the usual crowd. Not just the diehards. Families. Casual viewers. People who had never watched a full women's basketball game before. They weren't showing up because they were told to. They were showing up because Caitlyn made the game feel accessible, dramatic, and alive. That kind of pull doesn't come from branding. It comes from authenticity. Meanwhile, the old power centers watched from a distance. There was no urgency to adjust. No reason to panic. In their minds, this was just another hot player enjoying a moment. The system had seen this before. Players came and went. Dynasties stayed. Except this time, the system wasn't in control of the moment. Caitlyn wasn't rising through established channels. She wasn't being packaged, promoted, or framed by the usual voices. Her popularity didn't need approval. It fed itself. And that's what made it dangerous. Because for the first time in a long time, women's basketball had a star whose influence didn't trace back to the traditional gatekeepers. She wasn't a product of the machine. She was proof the machine wasn't required anymore. As Iowa games started pulling unexpected ratings and social clips spread far beyond the usual circles, the gap widened. The attention Caitlyn was generating wasn't something you could quietly absorb into the old narrative. It existed outside of it. And that's when the tone began to change. Not publicly at first. Not aggressively. Subtly. Because when power realizes it's losing relevance, it rarely lashes out immediately. First, it minimizes. It reframes. It downplays. And while Caitlyn kept stacking performances, the people who once held the keys started watching a little more closely. Not with admiration, but with discomfort. They hadn't just missed on a recruit. They had underestimated what happens when talent grows without permission. And that realization was only just beginning to sink in. At first, the attention around Caitlin Clark felt manageable. Another exciting college star. Another season of buzz. Another wave that would eventually break and settle. That's how the system had always worked. But this wave didn't settle. It grew. And more importantly, it grew outside the traditional control points of women's basketball. Caitlin's rise wasn't being guided by legacy media narratives or filtered through the usual voices that decided what was legitimate. It was happening in real time, driven by clips, reactions, and fans who didn't need permission to be excited. That was the shift. Sold-out arenas weren't being manufactured through hype campaigns. They were happening because people wanted to be there. Record-breaking TV numbers didn't come from forced promotion. They came because casual viewers kept tuning in again. And once that kind of momentum starts, it doesn't slow down easily. The logo threes weren't just impressive. They were symbolic. They broke the visual language of the game. Suddenly, women's basketball didn't look the way people expected it to look. It felt bolder, faster, more daring. That change mattered. Because the sport had spent years fighting for attention, using the same traditional arguments: fundamentals, discipline, purity of the game. Caitlin didn't reject those things. She added something else: spectacle. And spectacle travels farther than tradition. Every viral clip pulled in someone new. Every packed arena created another story. Every record broken fed the narrative that something historic was unfolding. What made this different was where the credit went. It didn't flow back to a program like UConn. It didn't reinforce an old dynasty. It didn't strengthen the voices that had always framed the sport. It centered on Caitlin. That independence changed everything. Because influence in sports isn't just about winning, it's about shaping conversation. And suddenly, the conversation didn't need the old power brokers anymore. Geno Auriemma had built a career not just on championships, but on authority. His voice carried weight because he represented the pinnacle of the system. When he spoke, people listened. But Caitlin's rise didn't run through him. And that absence mattered. For the first time in decades, the most powerful force in women's basketball wasn't connected to UConn's pipeline. It wasn't validated by his approval. It didn't need his endorsement to thrive. And that created tension. Because when authority isn't needed, it starts to feel invisible. That's when the framing shifted. Instead of celebrating what Caitlin was doing, the narrative around her began to subtly shrink. Her game was described as flashy instead of effective. Her dominance was framed as fun rather than foundational. The implication was clear. This wasn't real greatness. It was temporary. Entertaining, sure, but not serious. That distinction matters. Because calling something fun is often a way of dismissing its impact. It's a way of saying, enjoy it now, but don't take it too seriously. But the numbers refused to cooperate. Ratings kept climbing. Attendance kept breaking records. Media coverage expanded instead of fading. And most importantly, the fan base didn't just grow, it diversified. People who had never followed women's basketball were now emotionally invested. They weren't showing up because they understood the history. They were showing up because Caitlin made them feel something. And that kind of connection doesn't disappear when the season ends. It carries over. That's when the discomfort became harder to hide. Because while Caitlin was becoming the face of a movement she never asked to lead, the old voices were losing their monopoly on relevance. Commentary that once felt authoritative now felt reactive. Instead of guiding the conversation, they were responding to it. And when influence starts slipping, one of two things usually happens. You adapt, or you defend. The defense came first. Subtle at first. Measured. Wrapped in analysis. But underneath it was something else. The realization that Caitlin Clark had built a brand no one could regulate, redirect, or rein in. And for someone used to deciding what mattered in women's basketball, That loss of control was more unsettling than any loss on the court. When power starts slipping, it rarely admits it. It reframes. It softens. It minimizes. That's exactly what happened next. As Caitlin Clark's presence grew impossible to ignore, the tone around her shifted. Not from fans, but from the people who once controlled the narrative. Instead of outright criticism, something more subtle appeared. Dismissal disguised as wisdom. Her game was called entertaining instead of dominant. Her shooting range was framed as reckless instead of revolutionary. Her impact was reduced to excitement, not substance. And then came the comments that revealed the mindset underneath. The suggestion that she played like she was just messing around in a driveway. On the surface, it sounded harmless. Almost playful. But context matters. Because in basketball culture, that phrase carries weight. It implies a lack of structure. A lack of seriousness. A lack of discipline. It's a way of saying, this isn't real basketball. And that distinction wasn't accidental. For decades, women's basketball had been defined by control, precision, systems. The belief that greatness only existed inside strict parameters. Caitlin's game challenged that, visually and philosophically. She didn't wait for perfect looks. She didn't stay inside invisible boundaries. She stretched the floor beyond what had been considered acceptable. That kind of freedom feels threatening to people who built their authority on structure. So instead of adjusting the lens tightened. Her success was framed as situational. Her highlights were treated like novelty. Her dominance was described as exciting but unsustainable. The subtext was clear. Enjoy it while it lasts. But again, the problem wasn't opinion. It was reality. The deeper Caitlin went into her college career, the harder it became to argue she was just a moment. Defenses built entire game plans around stopping her, and still failed. Opponents sold out arenas simply because she was in town. That doesn't happen by accident. Yet the commentary didn't evolve. It calcified. Instead of acknowledging that the game itself was changing. The change was treated like an anomaly, something external, something separate from real basketball. And that's where the disconnect widened. Because while analysts and gatekeepers debated whether Caitlin's style was sustainable, the audience had already decided. They weren't confused. They weren't skeptical. They were convinced. They showed up. They stayed engaged. They brought new viewers with them. That's the part that stung. Not that Caitlin was great, but that she was great without approval. Her rise didn't validate the old voices. It bypassed them. And when bypassing becomes the norm, authority starts to feel ornamental. That's where insecurity creeps in. Not loud insecurity. Not angry outbursts. Quiet ones. Small comparisons. Subtle reframing. Gentle reminders of past dynasties. The narrative slowly shifted from what Caitlin is doing to how it compares to what we've already seen. That isn't analysis. That's containment. Because if you can fit her into an old box, you don't have to admit the box is outdated. But no matter how much the commentary tried to shrink her impact, the gap between words and results kept widening. Caitlin wasn't just drawing attention. She was changing habits. People planned their schedules around her games. Networks adjusted coverage. Media outlets led with her performances because they knew engagement followed. That's not a phase. That's power. And as that power became undeniable, minimization stopped working. So the approach changed again. Because when you can't shrink the player, you start questioning the people who believe in her. That's where things crossed a line. Up until then, everything had been subtle. Side comments. Dismissive framing. Carefully worded critiques that could be brushed off as just analysis. Then the restraint slipped. Because when authority feels its grip weakening, it often reveals what it actually thinks. Not about the player, but about the people supporting her. Caitlin Clark wasn't the target anymore. Her fans were. They were labeled delusional, unknowledgeable, disrespectful to the game. The claim wasn't just that Caitlin might struggle at the next level. It was that the people who believed in her were harming women's basketball by being excited. That their optimism was embarrassing. That their belief was misplaced. This wasn't analysis. It was contempt. And that distinction matters, because fans aren't just spectators anymore. In modern sports, they are leverage. They drive ratings. They dictate sponsorship interest. They decide which narratives spread and which ones disappear quietly. Calling them clueless isn't critique. It's a misread of where power actually lives. The timing made it worse. Women's basketball was experiencing a surge unlike anything before. New viewers were tuning in. Families were filling arenas. Jerseys were everywhere. Conversations were happening outside the usual circles. This was growth the sport had chased for decades. And instead of welcoming it, the reaction was pushback. The implication was clear. These fans didn't belong. They hadn't earned the right to be excited. They didn't understand the real game. That message didn't land the way it was intended. Instead of humbling Caitlyn's supporters, it unified them. People don't respond well to being told their enthusiasm is a problem, especially when that enthusiasm is producing real results. The more dismissive the tone became, the more obvious the disconnect looked. This wasn't a veteran voice protecting the game. It was someone uncomfortable with where the attention was going. And the irony was impossible to ignore. The same fans being criticized were the reason women's basketball was breaking viewership records. They were why networks cared. Why sponsors invested. Why players across the league were gaining visibility. Calling them a liability didn't just sound harsh. It sounded out of touch. And once again, Caitlyn didn't respond. No quotes. No clapbacks. No statements. She didn't defend her fans publicly. She didn't escalate anything. She let the comments exist on their own. Because she didn't need to win an argument. She was about to win something much bigger. What followed wasn't immediate. No dramatic moment the next day. No single performance that ended the conversation overnight. Instead, there was a stretch of games where reality slowly cornered the narrative. Every time Caitlyn stepped on the floor, the predictions against her weakened. Every accolade made the criticism harder to justify. And the most uncomfortable part, the very outcome that had been mocked, the idea that she could finish near the top of league honors, was becoming more realistic every week. That's when the shift became irreversible. Because once results align with belief, authority collapses. And the fans who had been labeled clueless were about to be proven painfully accurate. There's a point in every power struggle where arguments stop mattering, where opinions no longer shape reality. That point arrived quietly. Caitlyn Clark didn't announce it. She didn't frame it as redemption. She didn't turn it into a moment. She just kept playing. And the results stacked up. Rookie of the Year. Not a debate. A conclusion. All WNBA first team. Not hype. Earned. Night after night, she wasn't just surviving at the highest level, she was shaping it. Then came the number that mattered most. MVP voting. The same projection that had been laughed at. The same belief labeled delusional. The same optimism critics said was disrespectful. Fourth. Exactly where her supporters said she would be. That detail landed harder than any headline. Because it wasn't just Caitlyn being validated. It was everyone who had been told they didn't understand the game. They weren't loud. They were right. And there was nothing left to argue. Caitlyn's response never changed. No victory laps. No shots at critics. No subtle digs. Just basketball. Deep threes that warped defenses. Quick reads that punished double teams. Pressure moments that were supposed to expose her. Every performance eroded the credibility of what came before. The more consistent she became, the more outdated the criticism sounded. And that's the part people underestimate. Being wrong is one thing. Refusing to adjust while being publicly wrong is another. Once the awards rolled in, the conversation shifted. What once sounded confident now sounded bitter. What was framed as wisdom started reading like defensiveness. The authority that tried to define Caitlyn's limits was now being defined by its failure to predict her success. And the coldest part? She never acknowledged the conflict. She didn't need to. The court handled it. Every sold-out game rewrote expectations. Every record broken erased old arguments. Every accolade made it impossible to pretend this was just a phase. By the end of that stretch, the question wasn't whether Caitlyn belonged. It was how anyone ever thought she wouldn't. That realization cut deeper than any personal feud could. Because it wasn't about losing an argument to a player. It was about losing authority to reality. That should have been the end of the story. But when influence fades, some people try one last move to reclaim it. And this time, it wasn't about commentary. It was about money. You can talk about investors. You can talk about vision. But without a face, none of it sticks. Everyone involved understood that. And there was only one face that could solve that problem instantly. Caitlyn Clark. By this point, her value was impossible to ignore, not just as a player, but as a catalyst. Wherever she went, attention followed. Ratings jumped. Media coverage expanded. Ticket demand surged. She didn't just bring fans. She brought legitimacy. For a league trying to establish itself as a serious force, Caitlyn wasn't just a target. She was the missing piece. The shortcut. The solution to a credibility problem that money alone couldn't fix. And that's when the dynamic flipped completely. Years earlier, she waited for a call that never came. Now the call was unavoidable. This wasn't about basketball fit anymore. It wasn't about development or system philosophy. It wasn't even about competition. It was about need. The same ecosystem that once dismissed her now required her presence to move forward. The same voices that questioned her impact suddenly depended on it. That contradiction was impossible to hide. Because when power needs what it once ignored, the offer doesn't come quietly. It comes dressed as opportunity. When the offer surfaced, it landed heavy. Over $1 million. 8 weeks. One of the largest financial proposals ever put in front of a women's basketball player. On paper, it sounded absurd to turn down. Short season. Massive payout. Minimal risk. The kind of deal athletes are told they are supposed to accept without hesitation. But this offer wasn't just money. It was a message. Because when you strip away the headlines and look at the timing, the intent becomes clear. This wasn't about believing in Caitlyn Clark's game. That belief arrived years too late. This was about leverage. The same voices that once questioned whether her popularity was real now needed that popularity to survive. The same ecosystem that dismissed her fans now depended on them to tune in, buy tickets, and legitimize a brand new league. The contradiction couldn't have been clearer. If her impact was exaggerated, why was the price so high? If the hype was artificial, why was it being pursued so aggressively? The truth sat in the middle. They didn't just want Caitlyn. They needed her. Without her, the league would have to grow slowly. Earn trust. Convince casual fans to care. Build narratives from scratch. With her, all of that happened instantly. Everyone involved knew it. This was never about 8 weeks of basketball. It was about reclaiming influence that had already slipped away. If Caitlyn joined, the story could be reframed. Her rise could be pulled back into the old orbit. Her success could be positioned as still connected to the same power structure she had already outgrown. It was supposed to be a reset button. But Caitlyn saw the offer differently. She didn't see opportunity. She didn't see validation. She didn't see security. She saw timing. The coach who once stayed silent was now loud. The system that once minimized her was now paying a premium. The fans who were mocked were suddenly essential. That doesn't feel like respect. It feels like desperation. And desperation is easy to recognize when you've spent years building without help. Caitlyn didn't need the exposure. She already had it. She didn't need the platform. She already was the platform. She didn't need the money. She had options. Most importantly, she didn't need the connection. Because she had already proven the most dangerous thing a gatekeeper can hear. I'm fine without you. That realization changes how an offer feels. What looks like generosity from one side, looks like dependency from the other. And Caitlin understood that. So when the moment arrived, there was no drawn-out negotiation. No public weighing of options. No media tour hinting at interest. Just a decision. One word. No. There was no announcement. No press release. No carefully worded explanation. Just a quiet refusal. And that silence did more damage than any public rejection ever could. Because when Caitlin Clark said no, it wasn't just a player declining a contract. It was a system being denied relevance, the very thing money was supposed to secure. This wasn't a negotiation that fell apart. It was a door that never opened. No counteroffer. No delay. No hesitation. That's what made it sting. If Caitlin had even entertained the idea, it would have suggested dependency. It would have implied the offer carried leverage, that the system still had something she needed. But she didn't blink. And in that moment, the balance of power became impossible to ignore. Because without Caitlin, the league didn't just lose a star. It lost its shortcut. The path that would have instantly pulled in millions of casual viewers disappeared overnight. What was meant to feel bold suddenly felt fragile. The seven-figure offer stopped looking like confidence and started looking like panic. The kind of move you make when time is running out and influence isn't what it used to be. Fans saw it immediately. The reaction wasn't sympathetic. It was surgical. People didn't debate whether Caitlin made the right choice. They understood exactly why she said no. Because this wasn't about basketball. It was about respect. And respect doesn't arrive late with a check attached. The league could still exist without her. It could still function. It could still try to grow. But now it had to do it the hard way. Earn attention, build trust, convince fans organically. Everything Caitlin had already done on her own. That contrast made the rejection louder than words ever could. The same people who once positioned themselves as architects of the sport were now scrambling to stay part of its future. The same voices that once dismissed her influence were forced to acknowledge it without her involvement. And there was no way to spin it. You can't frame a rejection as collaboration. You can't rebrand refusal as partnership. You can't claim control when the other side walks away. The silence around Caitlin's decision spoke volumes. She didn't attack. She didn't embarrass anyone publicly. She didn't explain herself. She simply removed herself from the equation. And by doing that, she exposed something uncomfortable. The system needed her far more than she ever needed it. That realization rippled outward, because this wasn't just about one league or one contract. It was about the illusion that power still flowed downward from a few select gatekeepers. Caitlin shattered that illusion without raising her voice. She didn't take the money. She didn't take the meeting. She didn't take the call that finally came. She moved forward. And in doing so, she marked the moment when the old structure stopped dictating the future. By the time the dust settled, it was clear this story was never really about one coach, one league, or one deal. It was about control. For decades, women's basketball operated under an unspoken rule. Power flowed downward. Certain programs defined legitimacy. Certain voices decided who mattered and who needed more time. If you were chosen, doors opened. If you weren't, you waited. Caitlin Clark didn't wait. She didn't tear the system down publicly. She didn't declare war. She didn't even acknowledge it directly. She simply outgrew it. That's what made her decision so disruptive. Because the most dangerous thing you can say to a gatekeeper isn't no. It's, I don't need you. And that's exactly what Caitlin proved. She built her brand without legacy protection. She grew her fan base without institutional approval. She changed the economics of the sport without asking permission. By the time the $1 million offer arrived, the power dynamic had already flipped. The money no longer represented opportunity. It represented dependency. And Caitlin refused to step back into a structure she had already surpassed. That refusal sent a message far beyond one league. It told every young player watching that the old path isn't the only path anymore. You don't have to chase validation from institutions that once controlled access. Fans decide value now. Attention creates leverage. Impact defines relevance. Not resumes. Not history. Not titles from decades ago. That's why this moment stung so deeply. Because it exposed something uncomfortable. The sport no longer revolves around the same centers of power. The gravity has shifted. And no amount of commentary or money can pull it back. Caitlin didn't crown herself. She didn't ask to lead a movement. She didn't position herself as a disruptor. She just played. And in doing so, she showed how outdated the old structure had become. The irony is none of this required confrontation. No feud. No public reckoning. Just one quiet decision. One refusal. One reminder that power only exists if people keep handing it over. That's why this story matters. Not because someone lost control, but because players are realizing they never needed it granted to them in the first place. And this won't be the last time it happens. These shifts are happening quietly, away from headlines and press conferences. Deals that fall apart in silence. Influence that fades without announcements. Power structures that crack when they are no longer needed. That's the real story shaping basketball right now. And if you want to stay ahead of it, the leverage plays, the off-court moves, the moments that quietly change the future, make sure you're locked in. Subscribe to Basket Now. Because we don't chase highlights. We break down power. We connect the dots they hope you miss. Stay sharp. Stay ahead. The next power move is already happening.